All right, thanks very much for having me here. I'm known for giving spicy talks, and I think this will be no different. So it's broadly kind of hopefully complementary to everything that we've heard so far, but the intention of this talk is to kind of present an alternate paradigm to this kind of top-down, very analytic approach to public policy that relies on metrics first, relies on a lot of analytical methods like cost-benefit analysis and randomized control trials. It's based on a lot of papers over the last couple of years and a lot of ongoing work, including with various governments in the UK, but that's still too early days to talk about. It's mostly based on this paper with some colleagues from Cambridge, where we were sort of trying to put forward these two different paradigms. One, the social planner perspective, which is a conventional economic way of thinking about optimal public policy design, and then what we call the citizen perspective, which is more the kind of political science and public policy scholarship way of thinking about optimal public policy design, and we were looking at complementarities there. So the motivation, as I say, is broadly to get economists, and I think most people here are economists, to think a bit differently about public policy, broaden your horizons, thinking about it a bit less from ideal circumstances and the Treasury's point of view, to thinking about it a bit more from the kind of messy perspective of a policymaker at the street level who's delivering services. Particularly in places like healthcare and social policy. The priorities of economists around analytical tractability in particular are often very different from the people who are delivering services. Kind of research question of mine is whether we can bring these two ways of doing things together. Okay, so let me sketch first what a kind of caricature, I guess, but I think still a decent model of what this scientific approach from economics looks like. So you start with a measurement instrument, something like life satisfaction scales. You validate and standardize that measure cross-contextually. So that's quite key. It should be for all settings. Then you roll this measure out at scale. So we've already done all this. Analyze the data using ideally causal inference techniques, derive policy interventions from that analysis, implement those policy interventions according to which ones have the best cost-benefit ratio, evaluate them again using randomized controlled trials, and then build a database for what works. I'm sure this is fairly familiar to a lot of you. But there is this very large literature, very large, in public policy scholarship that basically argues that this approach often ends up, not always, it can be very effective, but often ends up actively undermining good policy. So one of the most recent examples from the UK is the kind of obsession with PISA scores and the impact that they have had on education. If you want to look at the broader literature on this kind of stuff, I would direct you to the critiques of new public management, which is a very large field, often quite bad. Like, don't get me wrong, there's a lot of bad literature in this space, but there's also a lot of good stuff. And one book that I think usually cuts through quite well with economists, and there's even an Econ Talk podcast about it, is Jerry Muller's The Tyranny of Metrics, which was published in 2019. And I think these problems that are identified in this scholarship are most prominent in areas that are very dear to well-being scholars, like mental health, community infrastructure, and community engagement, and the environment. And there's kind of three broad reasons why this kind of economistic approach tends to struggle with these areas. The first is that a lot of the concepts that are involved are very value-laden. So well-being, for example, is what makes a life go well, or what is good for somebody. So this is inherently an ethical concept. So we need to define it using a value judgment. And in democracies, we typically think that this is something that should be left to citizens, not to technocrats. Often public policy is delivered by very complex systems. It does not come in the form of discrete interventions. And this makes it quite difficult to run effective RCTs. If you look at the literature on, say, obesity policy or the structural determinants of mental health, RCTs have been in some ways abandoned there because they didn't end up solving the problem. And there's much more of a move to messier agent-based models and simulations. And finally, a lot of the things that you are interested in terms of both the causal drivers, the mechanisms, and the outcomes are multidimensional, highly interrelated, and very qualitative. And that's quite difficult to then apply cost-benefit analysis to. Now, I think this is all very annoying for the kind of the Treasury view. And I think that at the moment, a lot of well-being policy scholarship among economists in particular is very dominated by the Treasury's point of view. So policy analysis tools for Treasury and statistical agencies and central agencies tend to analyze and pay for policy, but not actually implement or deliver it. So they might craft it initially, but then they'll let it go and some other line ministry will be the one who's stuck with it for a long time. So they want control from a distance. They want the view from 30,000 feet. So thinking about things like internationally comparable metrics, or at least nationally comparable metrics across jurisdictions. You can contrast this with the kind of complexity that might be involved in something like fixing the NHS in Britain. So this is a hugely difficult challenge, very messy, super complex. You're just not going to be able to do it from this kind of high-level view. You're going to have to get into the swamp. All right, now, I worry sometimes that in economics, particularly among academics, so academics have their particular preferences, particular needs, and then they think that policymakers should follow those needs. But I would instead suggest that we need to listen to the policymakers about what their needs are. So for example, very strong emphasis at the moment in economics on randomized controlled trials as the gold standard of evidence, and cost-benefit analysis as the key tool for determining what policies we should implement. Now, in prioritizing these two tools over, say, agent-based models or expert judgment or this kind of stuff, there's a very strong prioritization of certain values, of certainty over the whole picture. So that's what we get from randomized controlled trials. Clear internal validity, not necessarily external validity. Identification as really a key thing that will get you published in the top 5 economics journals, rather than the system view that characterizes things like obesity policy. Very strong emphasis on formal calculation over expert or intuitive judgment. And I know there are very good reasons for that. And then also a strong emphasis in cost-benefit analysis on unidimensional and cardinality in order to get us precision. One number compared across everything, and then we derive our policy from there, rather than multidimensional and ordinal reality. All right, now take a look at a policy area that I spend a lot of time working in, and I try to illustrate why this kind of approach might just lead to kind of bad policy in that area if you preference these things ahead of these things. So I'm talking about the area of complex disadvantage. So this is where an individual or a community is suffering simultaneously from poverty, homelessness, mental health issues, drug use, domestic violence, perhaps a lot of other interrelated issues. These solutions to this problem, which is itself a complex problem to start with, tend to be quite complex. So one of the more effective charities in this space in terms of transitioning people out of complex disadvantage is the MayDay Trust, which works in London. They're a partner organization of mine. They have a coaching model that's kind of like old school social work. So a person in complex disadvantage meets with their coach every 1 to 2 weeks and just tells their coach whatever it is that they think they need right now to help them sort their life out. Could be a whole range of stuff. It might be income payments, but it might also be childcare, cooking lessons, a new fridge. They might just desperately need a vacation, like they're at their wit's end and they just want a day off, and they just need someone to carry their cognitive load for a day so they can go for a walk in a park or something like that. So whatever it is that they need, the coach helps them do. And then over a very long period of time, we tend to see outcomes. Now, progress is typically incremental and non-linear. So I would even say like almost stochastic. You get kind of, sorry, not stochastic, staccato. You get kind of sudden jumps, sudden little improvements, and then long periods of nothing much going on. And it seems kind of chaotic. The kind of things you're looking at are less drug use, not going from 0 to hero immediately, more regular therapy and finding that they have a better fit with a counselor, some work hours, not full employment. Often those work hours are very casual, very informal, stable income or stabilizing income, healthier relationships, and then a crucial one, greater self-efficacy, which is efficacy a self-reported measure that a lot of Treasury officials don't like. An evaluation of these things is then also often messy and mostly qualitative. So we get reports from the caseworker, we get reports from the therapist, we get reports from the landlord. It's very difficult to couch any of these things in terms of numerical quantifiable numbers. So cost-benefit analysis in trying to evaluate which policy is most effective for addressing complex disadvantage wants to boil all this down to a number that is cross-contextually comparable across different instances of complex disadvantage and different interventions to fix it. And that often ends up forcing policymakers to do bad work. So one of the most common complaints you get from social workers in the UK is that they got into this industry to try to help people, and now they feel like they are perpetuating the harms they wanted to solve because they are stuck in a bad system. And by bad system, they really mean the evaluation frameworks. All right, so this kind of way of doing public policy, I would characterize, or we characterize in this paper, as a top-down approach, or the social planner perspective. So you have metrics and analytical tools first. They are given primacy, and then you fit policy to the metrics. I think this appears very analytical and rational. I was myself very compelled by it when I did my PhD in economics, but I've noticed that it often results in ineffective policy. And one reason for that is that these high-level metrics aren't very informative. They don't have a lot of diagnostic power. So if you were thinking about what to do with the NHS in the UK, life expectancy wouldn't tell you a lot about what is going right or what is going wrong in that system. Okay, so what is an alternative? So we are developing this. So I'm not going to present to you an awesome book-length treatment here. This is the work in progress, but we are proposing a kind of more bottom-up approach where you put citizens and politics first. So you start where policy meets a user, not in the central agency. You work back from the coalface of public policy, and you fit metrics to policy. I think that's one of the key claims that we're making. You are dealing with thick concepts like well-being, so you want citizen involvement in the development of the policy so that their value judgments are centered. There are very complex policy areas, so you want to take the practitioner's perspective, that street-level bureaucrat, the social worker, or whoever it might be. You want to take their expertise seriously. And then there's also a lot of technical complexity, so it's worth having academics and other analysts involved in the process as well. What we are trying to do is develop a standardized, generalizable process for developing well-being frameworks in this context, rather than standardized and generalizable metrics. Okay, I'll give you a case study from our work with Turn to Us, which is a national digital anti-poverty charity in the UK. They used to give one-off grants. As a result of our work, they now give a lot more follow-up grants. They transitioned from a couple of years ago, helping people to survive. They said, we want to help people thrive, not just survive. But then they need a theory of what thriving in financial hardship is. They wanted to co-produce that, and they got us in as well-being experts to help them do that. Okay, so there are three groups that we try to bring together. You have the lived experience people. They're bringing their values. They're going to help us produce legitimate outcomes. Then you have the professional experts. They're going to help us produce practical outcomes that are readily implementable, immediately implementable, not 10 years down the track. And then you have the academic experts who are going to help ensure that what you come up with is rigorous. I would also add that it'd be really good to get funders involved in this kind of thing, because funders are generally very untrusting of what goes on in these kind of spaces. They want that objective metric that they can be confident in. It's clear, easy to measure. If you get them involved in this long process of co-production, they start to appreciate the messiness. They start to build rapport with the people who use the service, the people who deliver the service, and they become more confident in messier metrics, multidimensional outcomes. Now, a lot of the time when this sort of work is done, it's purely qualitative, N of 6, no one has any confidence in it. I was an economist in a past life, so I do love big data, all this kind of stuff. So when we did our work with Turn to Us, we started with a very large N survey of the people who've been through their services. Then we had a working group that was informed by this survey evidence. That working group consisted of representatives from these three groups that I mentioned earlier, and we did very detailed qualitative work for several months, thinking about what thriving means in financial hardship, how Turn to Us could help with it, how we could measure that. Then we had this workshop where we brought in another 13 or so people with lived experience to give further qualitative detail and to check that what we had done was representative and that we hadn't missed a lot of key stuff. And then once we had this final report come out of that workshop, we then took it again to an online survey to see whether people broadly agreed with what we had come up with. Now, I think really important thing for me was that there's a two-way learning process here. So it's not like I am the academic, I know what well-being is, I know how it should be measured, and I'm going to tell it to you. Everyone learns from everybody. So I just focus on my own learning experiences. So one thing I learned from talking to a person with lived experience of being disabled and in poverty in the UK was about the social model of disability and the disabling society. That was really enriching for me, changed a lot of my thinking around well-being to be much more structural. Another thing that I learned is that multi-item instruments, so standard capabilities questions, standard psychometric questions, deter people from seeking financial help when they're in desperation. This was one of the main learnings of the charity. So they wanted just a very short one-item, ideally, questionnaire, and they had very clear evidence, I think, of adaptive preferences and some other issues for why life satisfaction scales were not appropriate to their needs. So we came up with this theory of well-being. I'm pretty short on time, so I might just skip this, but broadly, let me give it very quick. So you have the means. They're the kind of basics that you need in order to thrive. But once you've got them, you're not thriving. It just allows you to start a process of figuring out what you want to do with your life. And then as that process matures, there will be certain indicators that you're thriving. Things like a sense of competence, autonomy, meaning and purpose. One thing I do want to underline though, is that this graphic and a lot of the other things we use to communicate our findings to the user base of Turn to Us and their funders and their internal workings, we co-produce the expression of our model. So I think academics will often think, well, we need to be technically precise, but in policymaking, you might often want to trade off technical precision for something that cuts through with your audience and is more meaningful and usable. All right, so a lot of the themes of the theory come out of very common well-being theories, but there are a bunch of quite contextual aspects that were also worth highlighting. So the people emphasize that having advocates and straightforward access to the welfare system that reduced the cognitive burden of poverty was extremely important to their well-being. So trying to design interventions that would address these sorts of things will be more effective than trying to guess based on data what might work. So using this kind of co-production process, you can arrive at immediate policy reforms. You don't have to figure them out by analyzing the data. You can just ask people what you should do. Okay, now the measure we came up with bespoke to the setting. So remember, they need one question and it needs to capture not just thriving, but also what Turn to Us does to help people thrive. Now they are trialing this at the moment, so I can't give you any feedback on how well it went. And I'm not certain that it's going to be great. But to what extent do you agree with the following statement? I have the time, space, and resources to plan for the future. So it's one of the main things that came out of the co-production is that when you're in financial hardship, you're trying to get on a positive trajectory. Even once you're kind of out of the poverty, you're not going to be thriving, but the key thing is whether you're looking forward optimistically. And then we also asked them at time 2, after the intervention, whether Turn to Us helped them with this problem, because that's the contribution that the charity wants to make and thinks it can make. Now, often when you see these kind of questions, the economists will say, well, what about comparability? How am I supposed to judge between policies on this basis? And I emphasize again that comparability is very important, but it's just one among many valuable things that we might want to pursue in public policy. If a policy is contextual, then emphasizing comparability is actually going to undermine our ability to make good policy. All right. You might still then say, well, what about budget constraints? Like we still have to make decisions. And I think this is true, but I think the way we are taught budget constraints in welfare economics is a bit divorced again from the reality of policymaking. Budgets are often politically created, not rationally. They are endogenous to policy. So after PEPFAR worked really well at great expense to the US government, they actually just increased its funding. So we can see all sorts of long-term endogeneity and path dependency in the way budgeting is done. And then when we look at other ways of budgeting, so not the way economists do it, but the way it happens politically, like in participatory budgeting, CBA isn't used and numerical stuff isn't used. People look across the options available to them and make a judgment. I think a key thing here is that we as economists want to be disinterested analysts, right? So we don't want to make value judgments. So we just want to apply a procedure. I mean, applying the procedure, we come out with a clear number and we say, that's it, up to you. You can make a decision now. But in real politics, we don't need to worry about that. We can let the public decide the weighting, and that's totally fine. That's how democracy would operate. All right, very quick final point. How would you scale this up? So you could actually get comparability. You repeat this process at adjacent nodes of public policy, and then you get representatives from all these different co-production units together, and you design a higher level framework for the next scale up. If you did this for multiple complex disadvantage, you could do it over here for disability, and then get representatives from those groups together and do one for social policy. So this is a bottom-up approach to the generation of metrics, generation of evaluation tools, generation of public policy outcomes. Obviously, there are limits to co-production. There's this comical La Sombrita thing that just came out of LA. San Francisco took 2 years and $2 million to build a public toilet because there was too much co-production, that sort of thing. Right, so it can be slow, tedious, and expensive. I'll conclude here. So I think progress for a typical citizen is not measured in internationally comparable variables. What well-being is can often be context sensitive, and we should at least complement our top-down approach with this kind of bottom-up, context-sensitive approach. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mark. I guess I am one of those economists you've been addressing, and I'll try to respond. I would want to ask you whether I get you correctly with that. In some sense, when you go to the slide you had, where you had the public, policymakers, and academic experts, you seem to think there's a role for academic expertise, and you expressly put there is a role for formal theories, requirement for rigor, and whatnot. Now, ribbing on economists and saying economists cannot be that, isn't that a little bit disingenuous in the sense that there could be, in our role as academic experts, we are striving for that. We want to see causal identification, we want to have measurement precision, and so on, and still then say the policy process is, as you argue, or should be bottom up. I mean, not every, I probably would even agree that many economists have this technocratic tyranny of the experts, to use the Gisoli's word, kind of thinking we address the social planner. But if you look at public choice, constitutional political economy, if you look at Bruno Frey and Alois Stutzer's work in happiness research, they said don't address the policymaker, address the general public, let the constitutional citizens, let them actually decide on that. So I understand that you want to provoke a little bit by saying economists need to be less like that, but I think academic economists do not need to be less rigorous. I think what you mean to say, or what you in all fairness should say, is if academic economists go into the policy context, then maybe we should be more bottom up than top down. Would that be a fair characterization?
Yeah, I mean, I hope that is what I'm saying. So I think Alois is kind of in the minority. I mean, I've spoken to Alois about this stuff before, and he feels like he's in the minority. So I don't think that pointing to a few exceptions necessarily disproves the general thrust. I totally agree that so as part of this kind of work here, I mean, I have left a very large role, I think, for the technical expert, but this is as part of a deliberation. The job of the technical expert is to help the public to arrive at a more enlightened understanding of what it wants. So an example of what you can do here is that if you go into a co-production exercise for a local development plan or something like that, and there's various considerations about, well, if we redevelop the high street or something like that, how much extra tax revenue would we get? How many more businesses would we attract? Then having an economist in there who's familiar with the causal inference of these kind of questions would be super helpful. They could say, well, you can't expect this much tax revenue. This is a more reasonable amount. You could expect these kind of businesses to turn up, this sort of thing. I think my key grievance is more, well, not grievance, that's too strong. The thing that concerns me a bit is this idea that economists should be making decisions, and that even if economists don't make decisions, that when they put the cost-benefit analysis out there and it's clean, then if the public or the politicians don't follow that decisions, then they're irrational morons, bias, bad. I'm very concerned about that. Like, I think we should be coming more from the democratic side.
Thank you, Mark. I loved it, and I completely disagreed with everything you said. But just to understand your claim a little better, is your claim that this bottom-up approach should replace both the policy construction and policy selection part of policy making, or should it only replace the policy construction part of policy making?
Actually, neither. So the key thing is that it should complement all these things. So I find that when I move in kind of elite academic technical circles, then there is only that first way of doing policy. And people who are trained in that way of doing policy don't necessarily perceive that there is this other way of doing it. And equally, I think people who do the other way don't understand where economists are coming from. So I actually, broadly, when I speak to them, I say the opposite. I'm like, you guys need to worry more about causal inference and this kind of stuff. And you need to worry more about representativeness and not an N of 6 qualitative study, these sort of things. So I would really like to see more complementarity, more mixed methods, more interdisciplinarity, that sort of thing.